Say that again? Which stand? The music stand. The music stand. Okay, yeah, I'm not actually gonna write on the board today. You should be able to. If I do, I'll. Read it. And you want to. I remember. Yeah, everything works.
Can't leave until we're done.
That's.
If
be
you
it.
have any video problems.
I will
stay
be-
close.
I will be on the property.
Yeah, well, yeah, outside.
I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, I
outside.
might be doing something with Lex,
Yeah,
but
well, okay.
We probably. Yeah, thanks for reminding me.
Hi, how are you? I'm good. Put my name up, do I show my name tag on? Yes, I do. How are you doing today? Doing okay? Tell me.
It's fine, for a while, 10 years.
I really appreciate your expertise.
I'm actually his neighbor. Yeah, so I thought I'd come and make sure you knew what I'm talking about. Yeah. It's always good, the more information you have.
Yeah, that's always good.
It's always good to gather some information. You know what I mean?
So thanks.
Be a nice day out there today. If you can keep it outside and support you.
Did you live someplace else?
No, we're actually down, where the fire station is.
Oh, don't apologize. No need to
Okay.
apologize, you know. No,
We're just a couple. We behind a couple blocks. After the, kind of like we're ahead of and here is on this bridge.
No.
No, it's. You want to be introduced,
well, like,
you want to be introduced to the paramedic?
here, right? Yeah. Yeah. Usually have a big crowd.
Well, this is over there, second one, but we got a good crowd.
No.
Thankfully, I listen to
Yeah. And if not, I don't mind anyway. Pressure. Have you ever been,
Mutuality.
So.
So.
so you don't have theater, but that.
Anyway.
That's impressive.
You're reminding us.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I will. That's fine. The Bible says. I know, I don't have my. Yeah, that's something I go over and do. So, you know, you open up that stage, you're like, great, look at all the other things you got.
Each thing, you know, and yeah. Fully controls, yeah.
There's lots of, sorry, wait. They're paid out. Some days there's lots, how much is that? I got drilled in my hair, this is how. Yeah, you know, right. So I appreciate, you know, sure we. Yeah, I kind of got all right. It's hard to tell. I'm curious. You're running home this week and hi, how are you? Living the dream, right? It's that right. Waiting for me to start down. Yeah, I'm his neighbor. Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm Nice to meet you. They just the last 5 months. Was yeah, which I don't know.
Anyway.
All this.
It's the funny stuff. I've lost 2 pairs of glasses in the past 3 years, and now I'm not allowed to just wear glasses anymore.
I was so excited.
She is, she went to.
You know what I am?
She went to synagogue.
One time that I like type.
I know, you just take classes, you know,
Yeah.
especially in a classroom full of kids and they're touching and they're all like, and they're like, ooh, look.
It's a whole this.
Director Michelle.
They're all this fancy.
You're so nice. There's some glass.
You.
Really.
Oh, yeah. I haven't seen it too many times. Then I was there and it's super late. Okay, here. Yeah. Very well.
Yeah.
Your hand, like I said. Glasses. These are glasses. They get much.
Oh, that's. You know, where they fall.
Yeah, and I stick with it. So then I put my computer glasses in here too.
If that has the.
Yeah. And then it doesn't take up value. I have things like a cake.
What should we talk about?
You don't know.
Right? I stayed for my wallet.
We actually,
All right, and sharing.
we have.
Yeah. My gosh, you're fine. Oh, I didn't use your name. Oh, I don't need sugar for anything.
Surprising.
Definitely gives me that.
Welcome, everybody.
Sorry, that's why we need. Now that my name is Jan.
Right up. Go right up.
And you later.
We're getting right up. Coming in together.
If you want me to scroll down so you can see the board, the same. Girls took me to Mexico. Yeah, they took me to Mexico for my.
Well, welcome, everybody.
So.
Very much to be,
Yeah. Yeah, it was,
welcome, to, the adult forum. We, had a good discussion last week, and then we were here. And, had some great ideas for things to talk about. Today, and so what I did is took some of those questions and made some handouts and a short, very short PowerPoint, and we'll talk a little bit about the Bible today, an overview of the Bible. So, okay, when we talk about the Bible, it's still streaming in. I'm so hot. So when we talk about the Bible, things usually start with something Martin Luther said about the Bible. He said, Jesus is the final interpreter and the final interpretation of all scripture. And what that means is you kind of have to filter everything through what Jesus said, what he did, his actions, his ministry. We filter everything in the Bible through that, and that's how we make sense of everything in the Bible. He also said, Martin Luther also said, and if he didn't say this, he should have. That the Bible is the manger that brings us Jesus. And we have to remember to kiss the Christ child and not kiss the manger. So, and that kind of has stuck with Lutherans through the years. So here's just a few basic facts about the Bible. If you're wondering, the Bible is not in chronological order. The Bible is arranged by category of books. So like they lump all the prophets together, and they lump all the history books together, and they lump all the, and so that can be kind of confusing. If you want to read the Bible and you want to start in Genesis, then you'll be jumping around a lot. And I don't really recommend. If you want to start reading the Bible, I don't recommend starting in Genesis. Just because most people quit in Leviticus. Dreadful book to try to read through. We don't have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. For the Old Testament, the earliest we have are 200 years before Christ, and That was kind of the big excitement of the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you remember the Dead Sea Scrolls. How many of you have ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? They were discovered back in the 1940s, and they were about 1,000 years earlier than the previously known manuscripts. So that was pretty exciting to discover scrolls that were, 1,000 years earlier. We don't have original manuscripts because most of the books were originally written on leather parchment or papyrus. And in Jerusalem, particularly, it gets kind of muggy and humid in the winter months, and so papyrus unravels when it's too muggy, and leather parchment will get kind of moldy, and so we don't have records of almost anything from those times. The chapters were, the original Bible didn't have chapters. The chapters were put in there by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the year 1227, something around there. And the verses were added about 300 years later by a French printer. And there's an old story that the French printer was doing this monumental task of putting verses in, and he was doing that while he was on a carriage ride across Europe. And every time he hit a bump, he made a new. That kind of highlights that sometimes the verses don't really work. Sometimes the verses are cut off at places they shouldn't be. So, anyway. There's 31,102 verses in the Bible. And so if you're looking for something, you can probably find a verse that will do that. And we're finding a lot, especially these days. People are using they pull out a verse in the Old Testament saying, "Man shall not sleep with another man," and that really has nothing to do with homosexuality. That's a different thing altogether. And they use verses like that to reinforce their own homophobia or their own racism.
The thing that gets me about sleeping together is more problematic to stay awake together.
Thanks for sharing that. I wouldn't have made that connection. So. Thanks for sharing. Back in the 1700s and 1800s, the Christian Church used the Book of Philemon, which is a letter from Paul to a guy named Philemon who was a slave owner. And Paul talks about stuff, but Paul doesn't come right out and say slavery is wrong. And so back in the 17 and 1800s, the church used that as well. This is a justification for slavery. And, certainly that's not what the point was, but again, if you want to find something in Scripture and are willing to take out one verse, you can probably find almost anything in there. And that's really what we need to do is we need to look at the whole of Scripture from beginning to end, and do that filtering through the mind and the teachings of Jesus, like I mentioned. When we do that, we get a much better picture rather than a verse here or there or whatever. Questions, comments so far?
How are meanings interpreted in the translations? Bringing this to the versions we know now. How many times was kind of meaning kind of reinterpreted.
Well, every
That's
time,
kind of abstract.
yeah,
That's the question.
yeah, every translation is an interpretation. And you'll see that in some of the versions that are translated by very conservative
I mean,
scholars.
Well, if there was a change in the interpretation, and a certain, what, series of words or whatever have some meaning behind them, and that was interpreted as having a certain meaning today. Now, if somebody else were to do the same reading and come up with a different interpretation, did that occur much? If you understand what I'm trying to say, it's,
I think, it happens, well, as, you know, words change over the course of. The biggest problem we have is in the King James Bible right now, that there's hundreds of phrases and words we don't use anymore that are in the King James Bible. So whenever they do a translation, they go back to the original manuscripts and say, what does this mean for today? Even Luther, when he translated the Bible, he wanted to be so careful in how to make it say the right thing that he would go down to the butcher and say, how would you say this? And so that's one of the reasons his was the most accurate translations up until that time. So is that what you read?
yeah, more or less, yeah, it's just how things change over time.
Yeah, yeah.
Even deep meanings.
Yeah.
And
Back to the verse you quoted, man shall not sleep with man. I've done some work with the RIC committee, I'm not here, but at my own church. And somewhere I read, and I read in one of the books, that depending on the version, now I think it's a King James that was, it does not refer to the word homosexuality. Some of the modern translations in the same verse use that word instead of another way of saying it.
Right.
And that fits in with exactly what you said now, that the interpretations or the translations or the new words were based on the issues at the time. And so that, you know, and if people will use the word homosexuality, whereas you refer back to man with man, it does not refer to that. But so whoever is interpreting is using kind of their own point of view or society point of view at the time.
Exactly. And some of the translators are pretty open about their biases. So, like does anybody have the New International Version translation?
that's,
Most of you probably have the there was a passage, I think it's Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah, where Isaiah says to the people, I did not, when you were in the wilderness, I didn't give you any command sacrifices and stuff like that. And in the New International Version, which is a very conservative version, they add the word, I did not just give you commands, because they were so uncomfortable with them. One part he did, and Isaiah says he didn't, so we better fix it for people. And so every version is an interpretation of some at some level, but most of you here have the New Revised Standard Version, which is it's a little harder to read than some of the other versions, but it tends to be more accurate.
I think Jim's comes with, they took, from original Greek. And there's, the word the, well, there might be 17 forms of the word the in Greek, so you don't know which the using. Or the other analogy is just 17 words for snow in the Alaskan language. You've got a word, but they have other choices to use for that word. You don't know exactly.
Yeah, it's not a simple process to do a translation.
Contact or seance.
So. Okay. So the Testament, there's 39 books in the Old Testament. Written over 1,000 years. Like we talked about last time, most of the Old Testament was compiled while they were sitting in exile in Babylon, and that was the years 580 something to 538. Compiled at that time. There were a couple of books that were written after that time, and so the book of Daniel was probably the last one to be written. It was written about 160 years, 150 years before Christ. Compiled in that one, you could have told me this. And the
We were hoping you would get that.
did I can't remember what I said. So the original language was Hebrew. There's a few chapters in Aramaic, which is language that Jesus spoke when he was Jesus and the disciples spoke. He was here, so. The Old Testament.
How many times did Jesus come out of his tomb?
One.
Okay.
Yes, I thought you were gonna make a joke. Okay. So the New Testament, 7 books, written over 50 years. James probably was the first book to be written, maybe, about 45. And the book of Revelation is probably the last one, about 95 AD or CE. So most of the books were in use, but by the year, most of the books we have in the New Testament were in widespread use by about 125 years, 125 AD or CE. There was some misinformation from what's that? Da Vinci Codes. You remember remember that book, the movie?
Yeah.
There was some misinformation there that where they said that the Council of Nicaea in 25 voted on the books of the Bible, and that really wasn't quite right. Most of the books were already in use by the year 125. At the Council of Nicaea, they made them official, but there wasn't any big bulk that they needed. They didn't need the bulk, and all the books were there. The original language was Greek, and so again, when they're translating the Bible, they have to go back to the original Greek. Questions about the New Testament?
I've heard of Josephus as being historian, historian, verified any parts.
A lot of, yeah, you're right. Josephus was a Jewish historian, and his work was doctored up by Christian monks over the years. So, like Josephus would say, and Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. And then you get this passage, and he really was the Son of God. And so, people are editing it later. There were a lot of Roman historians who were writing at that time. And so they different parts of the Bible are show up in these histories. So yeah, it's and archaeology too has shown some of those things too.
Was Josephus the one who was in Jerusalem in the AD 70 when Rome sacked Jerusalem?
I can't remember if he was That was him. He was certainly alive during that time. I don't remember if he was there.
The translations go back to the original Greek. Are the manuscripts still around? The original manuscripts for the New Testament?
Yeah, you know, I thought I had a difference. I was gonna post the oldest manuscript we have up there as a picture, but that's not it. So just imagine that what we have, the earliest translation or the earliest manuscript we have is about 150 AD. It was from the Gospel of John. It's about this big. And and then, you know, it doesn't take long before we get more and more of those.
So they do have the original.
They don't have the originals, but they have pretty early copies.
Early copies, okay.
Second semester of basic Bible at good old Augsburg over there. Dr. Benson was saying that they started writing these books down about in this AD 60 because until then it was oral tradition. And the people who had seen it originally were dying,
Right.
and they wanted to get Jesus's words down,
Right.
so that they wrote them and they were just spread among the communities.
Right.
Doing that.
But yeah, a lot of the early Christians, right after, you know, the disciples and that, they thought Jesus was going to come back any day. And so who needs to write it all down? Well, but yeah, when the disciples started to die, they thought, man, we better get this down. All right, so anything else on the New Testament? So here's some 3 words that we use to describe scripture. This is a picture over here, a picture of Paul asking an angel how to spell resurrection. That's very famous. Very famous.
Good to know.
I'll give you this. So these words are often interchanged, and they're sometimes confused and stuff. So I'll give you kind of the official definitions in my words. Inspiration means that God had a hand in getting in there what is in there. God had a hand in and we don't know what that means. Paul describes it as all scripture is God breathed. Well, I don't know what that means, but we don't have to know what it means, right? What we have to know is that God had a hand in it somehow to get in there what needs to get in there. It goes back to that idea that Jesus is the final interpreter of the final interpretation of scripture. Everything in there is meant to help us understand Jesus. I'll give you an example. In the book of 2 Samuel, King David is about to invade Jerusalem. Jerusalem at that time wasn't owned by him; it was owned by the Jebusites. And King David wanted Jerusalem, so he laid siege to it. So he brought his army and they laid siege around Jerusalem. And Jerusalem had really big walls, really good solid walls. And the Jebusites were so they were just so confident that David could never get in that they would taunt him from the walls and shout down, even our walls are so good, even our blind and lame people could keep you out. Well, David found a way in through the sewer system. And the first thing he did is they go, kill all the blind and lame people. Kill all the blind and lame people. Okay. That's a horrible story. Why is that in the Bible? First time David went into Jerusalem, he killed blind and lame people. What's the first thing Jesus did when he went into Jerusalem? He healed the blind and lame people. So Jesus didn't do that just because he was a nice guy. He did that to say, I'm a different kind of king than David was. David ruled with a sword. I want to be invited into people's hearts. Okay, that makes sense? So all those Bible stories, all have connections to the New Testament somehow. Let's see, this inspiration makes sense.
Yep.
God got in there what he needed to get in there. Any questions? The second one is inerrancy. That's the idea that Lutherans aren't real big on inerrancy. But it's popular in some parts of the church. Inerrancy is the belief that every word in the Bible is literal, historical, factual truth. As if somebody walked around with a video camera and filmed everything and then wrote it down without error. So like we talked about last week, book of Genesis chapter 1, a person who believes in inerrancy will say, this is, God created the world in 24-hour days. And that's all there is to that first chapter. And so they'll, in fact, some people will ask, well, where did the dinosaurs come in then? And I've actually heard some inerrancy people say, well, there never were any dinosaurs. God put fossils in there to test. I think God has a sense of humor, but Will's deception is probably not in his wheelhouse. The idea of inerrancy has only been around for about 150 years. And you can guess, started in the late 1800s, you can probably guess which scientists they were reacting against. Darwin, yeah. Darwin came out in 1870, came out with a book called The Descent of Man, says that people came from lower life forms. And instantly the church said, no, everything in the Bible is exactly historical. Exactly historical truth.
The world's only 5,000 years old.
Yes, yeah.
Nothing was there before that.
Right. There was a bishop named Usher. I forget what year it was, 1700s maybe, where he added, where it says so and so begat so and so and so and so begat. He sat and added up all the years and came out with that the world was created on September 15th, 6006 at 9 a.m. I don't know how he got to 9 a.m. But yeah. So, and there's a lot of people in the church today who are still we call young earth creationists who believe 6,000 years old is how it started.
But then I think the one time that I was wondering, what was God's calendar like, those first 6 days, because it was at the Grand Canyon. And, you see the different colors and, they tell you, oh, well, this was this period, this was this period. No, but, God made this and you're thinking, well, I wonder what his day was like, because
His day was like?
Yeah. You got the mountains and you got the waters and everything else, because, that just can't happen in an instant. Or we don't know. I mean.
Yeah, our days are not his days.
Right.
That's for sure, so.
Do people who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible then, do they think that God wrote this all?
Mostly, yeah.
Okay,
Word
he just wrote, because I worked with a young lady, a delightful girl, but she really believed that, and I was just amazed at that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was really a thing, you know.
Yeah, it's almost,
so
it's
light
almost like a
girl.
dictation, yeah, God dictated the Bible.
Yeah, yeah.
It's when I'm in Texas, I can't open my mouth.
Inerrancy.
That's what we.
They don't even understand she.
You don't have to go to Texas, I have family like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, infallibility is the last one. And, infallibility is simply that, in matters of faith, the Bible is trustworthy. Okay, and so we're good. Lutherans have traditionally been really good with that one. Bible isn't a science book. You can't get science facts from there. In fact, one of Martin Luther's not so good moments was when Copernicus came out. Remember Copernicus? He was the guy who said the Earth goes around the sun. But before that, everybody thought the sun went around the Earth, and they were contemporaries. Luther was a contemporary of Copernicus, and Luther said, "No, Copernicus is wrong." Because in the Bible, in Joshua, it says God made the sun stand still. And so clearly that means the earth, the sun goes around the earth. And then he called Copernicus an idiot who's trying to change the whole science of astronomy. And that's exactly what he was doing. So again, that wasn't one of Luther's better moments. But that has to do with infallibility. Book isn't the Bible isn't a science book, it's a faith book. And on matters of faith, we trust by that. Questions about any of these?
Last week and this week too, we were talking about how the Torah got compiled during the Babylonian exile.
Yeah.
That's our understanding now in the 21st century of when those books were first written down. Was that always the understanding from like 580 or 500 BCE on forward that yes, this was historical? Like if you'd ask somebody in 8400, if you'd ask Constantine, hey, when is the Pentateuch written? Would we have talked about the Babylonian exile, or is that something that we came to understand later on the historical context?
Our Jewish brothers and sisters knew that, and were pretty open. Yeah, it was part of it during the Babylonian exile. Christians have a wide variety of ways of understanding what it is. Any other questions? So I have some handouts here for you. I have we'll probably get just started on the first one today. So if you need a handout, there's some of it. Do we have some on the table today? Yeah. Yes. Who needs who needs anybody need one? Couple up here.
The two gems.
So we're going to look at books of the Bible. The one titled Books of the Bible.
Oh, we can get that one.
Thank you.
We just need
Books of the Bible.
There we go.
As I said, the books of the Bible are kind of organized by category. And so here's the categories that we use in the Christian Bible. The Jewish our Jewish brothers and sisters have a different ordering, which I happen to like better, but this is what we have. The first 5 books are sometimes called books of the law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Because there's lots of laws in them. Sometimes they're called books of Moses, Jesus, because Moses is kind of the main character in these first 5 books. The main thing in those first 5 books that you want to keep an eye out for is the covenant that God made with Abraham. In Genesis 12 and again in Genesis 15, God made a covenant with Abraham, saying, I'm gonna make you the father of a great people. And we're gonna use that people to unify all people back to God. And so we're watching that play out in the first 5 books, those first 5 books. The books of history are listed there, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Judges, 2 Samuel, 3rd. And that's entering Canaan. What happens once they get into Canaan? They set up. They start off with judges. Each kind of tribe has their own judge. Each of the 12 tribes has their own judge. It's kind of a leader. And then they say, well, no, we want a king. And God says, no, I'm your king. You don't need a king. And they said, well, we still want a king. And so at first they gave him Saul, then they gave him David, and then Solomon. And there's a real focus in these history books on the temple. Solomon, early in his reign of terror, said, I want to build you a temple. He said to God, I want to build you a temple. And God said to the 2 Samuel, God said, no, I don't really want a temple. I kind of like moving around among my people, and I'm just fine. And the next thing you know, turn around and Solomon is building the temple. And so they basically believed God was in. There's a tiny little room in the back of the temple called the Holy of Holies, and that's where they believed God was. And they kind of locked him up back there. Probably why God didn't want to. Didn't want to be locked up in that back room. In like books of Kings and Chronicles, we hear kings, but really all we hear about is what their relationship to the temple was. So the temple was really their interest. Books of poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, poetry. Major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, Ezekiel, Daniel. Minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, so anybody know the difference? Why we call some major and some minor? This is a deep theological.
Size of the book.
The size of the book. Yeah. The major prophets are longer, and the minor prophets are shorter. Not physically. The important thing to remember about the prophets is they didn't foretell the future. When we think about prophets today, the automatic definition comes up as they foretell the future. They didn't foretell the future. They proclaimed what God asked them to proclaim. Usually to a people that didn't really want to hear what they had to say. And so they spoke God's word to people that were often pretentious and believed they were doing all the right religious stuff. They did a lot of good religious stuff, but they didn't feed the hungry. They didn't, shelter the homeless. They didn't do that stuff. And so the prophets were proclaimed the truth boldly and didn't care where the chips fell in calling that out. I think the prophets are the most timely books today that the church needs to read today, unfortunately. Questions, comments on that?
Yeah, first of all, can you say why you think that those are so relevant for today, that these prophets are relevant for today? And second, this reminds me of the prophets, where they're talking about the people at the time. Back about a little over 30 years ago, I taught at a private school out in Eau Claire. And we had teachers that it was a religious school, evangelical, but non-denominational. And we were assigned, for our grades, different books and different areas of the Bible to teach. And the scary thing about that is that when you have lay people teaching kids the book of Daniel and looking at it as foretelling the future for now and the end of the world, first of all, it's inaccurate. Second of all, it can scare the living daylights out of the kids.
Yeah, and you gotta be really creative.
Yeah, so, when I heard what they were doing and I really couldn't say anything, I think there can be really a danger in having lay people to some of these books.
Or at least like people who don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of like this too. Something. Right. What was your first question?
Think about why these prophets are relevant for today.
Well, that's a good question. I think we have some of the same problems in the church today that they did then. If you listen to a lot of the right-wing parts of the Christian church, and unfortunately I listen to them a lot. They say things like we shouldn't be doing social ministry, we shouldn't be feeding the hungry, or sheltering the homeless, or taking care of the widows and orphans, because that's socialism. And did you read the prophets? Because they were pretty serious about it. And so we've got a church that in the United States that in many parts is very pretentious. They feel like they have all the answers, and they have so many answers they no longer have questions. And that's a really dangerous place to be when you don't have any questions. And so the prophets went into those people and gave them the right answer. It's kind of like I know my dog loves me, but if I had a squeaker in me, he would get me like a that's what the prophets did. Because they just got it deep. So yeah.
Would you consider, or we would consider our prophets to be?
Oh, God. That is a really good question, and we're out of time. Let's hit that next week, first thing. Sarah, did you have your hand up?
Well, yeah, I'm thinking about it, we're thinking about like the Bible coming into being and that I think a lot of times when I talk to people about the Bible, a stumbling block is that in the scriptures, it seems that there's this human divine relationship. There's quotes that we put around, and God said, and this goes back and forth throughout this, telling of these stories. So how did they know what God's saying? How do you conceive of God's voice being heard, received, interpreted, and then written down? And how do we think about that as people that are trying to receive those stories but comprehend what a relationship, a human divine relationship continues to look like? And how are we so sure what God said?
We've never been very good at that throughout church history, have we?
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think the Bible just makes it feel we feel lonely or more kind of I don't know, where.
Yeah. How come God doesn't talk to me?
Yeah, and how do they know? How do they know what to write down? Did they hear something actually? Yeah. That would just be interesting.
Wow. Why did God choose the time he did to put Jesus on earth?
Sorry, next week.
Can we bring that up at the end of the hour next?
I kind of expected Mike, where's Mike, to bring up stuff like that. Okay, next week we'll continue this, so bring these back if you, are gonna be here next week, and we'll, continue the discussions. Thank you very much for coming, thank you.
Isn't it interesting that Pastor Sarah's in the back of the room? They're pretty.
That's a good.
They haven't stopped.
Deacon Chair.
Are you saying?
Get enough.
I need some.
Yes, you have. It does,